This is the Anthrobiology Podcast, hosted by me, Gabby LaPera. Every 2 weeks, I interview a biological anthropologist about what makes us, us. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Anthrobiology Podcast. Joining me today, I have Dr. Daniel Benyshek of the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Hello, how are you?
Hi, Gabby. I'm doing well. It's nice to join you again.
I am really excited to have you. Listeners, the reason he said again is because we have actually talked for the Cannibalism podcast, which is coming out this year. I promise you. I know I've been talking about it for literally 3 years, but it's actually happening. And we will talk a little bit about cannibalism today. But Dr. Benyshek, can you give a little introduction for yourself and talk about what you study?
Sure. I'm a medical anthropologist. Most of my career has been dedicated to issues of maternal and child health. Really, the first half of my academic career focused on cardiometabolic disease and the developmental origins of cardiometabolic disease. Developmental origins is another way of talking about epigenetics for most folks. So, and particularly in high prevalence populations, native populations and others, so health disparity research. I'm still interested in that, but about 12 years ago or so, my career took a slight detour. Still interested in maternal health, but this was focused on alternative and complementary approaches to maternal health. And in particular, an emerging practice at that time that was really getting into the mainstream, which was women eating their placentas postpartum for a whole range of purported health benefits. And I learned about this at a brown bag lecture on campus one day. I'd never heard really about it with respect to humans. I knew that this was something that many mammals did, but I had no idea that women were doing this at this time, and became just fascinated with it, and was even more surprised to find out that really no serious research was going on. There had been some research, interestingly, in the previous century, but really there was no contemporary research investigating this. And this is at a time when it was really sort of a really burgeoning trend, and you were reading about it in newspapers and online, and there was lots of sort of sensational coverage of it. And so I thought it was time to do some real research on it.
I really, really want to talk about that. But first, because I actually think you are our first medical anthropologist on the show, can you explain what that is?
Sure. Well, medical anthropology is a very, very broad specialty within anthropology. There are medical anthropologists. I would say the majority of people who identify as medical anthropologists are trained as cultural anthropologists. But there are certainly plenty of folks like myself that consider themselves crossover, biocultural. And then there are some that are also strictly trained or primarily trained as biological anthropologists. Just depends on the questions being asked. And medical anthropology is really interested in all things relating to human health and healing. It's interested in evolutionary origins of health and disease. It's interested in healing practitioners of all types. It's interested in ritualistic behaviors associated with health. It's interested in health disparities, and there's epidemiology. So again, really all things having to do with human health and disease.
I took a medical anthropology course when I was a junior in college, and it actually made me like almost reconsider, because I was like very much on the osteology, evolutionary biology track. And I took that course and I was like, this is the first time cultural anthropology was so interesting to me, because we talked about how like different cultures view the same condition across, and it was mind blowing to me. Like, apparently, so from what I'm reaching way back into my memory, one of the things that Americans are very concerned about is high cholesterol, high blood pressure, et cetera, et cetera. Germans are actually very concerned about having low blood pressure, which is it's so interesting to me, especially as someone who has incredibly low blood pressure and is dizzy all the time. I'm like, I get you, Germans.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, the relativistic perspective with culture, sort of, especially the cultural attitudes and beliefs, is endlessly
It's
fascinating.
so interesting. And I don't really know how y'all have escaped my gaze for this podcast up until now. So I'm really excited to have you on to talk about this. Um, Placentophagy. Phagy, just in case you are wondering, comes from Latin for eating, eater.
Mhm.
So anytime you hear phagy or phagus, that's something that is eating something else. It's really common with different types of immune cells. That's probably where you'll hear it the most.
Mhm.
Um, Sometimes you'll hear anthropophagy, which is eating other people.
Mhm.
Also relevant to this story. So placentophagy. Where should we start with this? I guess let's actually start with placentophagy in animals, if that's okay with
Sure,
you.
sure.
You mentioned that this is something that's actually pretty common amongst mammals.
Yeah, and even, even whatever it's been now, 12, 13 years ago, when I first sat down at that brown bag lecture, I knew that mammalian mothers typically would lick their newly born offspring and lick off the amniotic fluid. This is, by the way, for your listeners, part of placentophagy. Placentophagy is considered eating any of the placental tissue, including the membranes, as well as the umbilicus and the amniotic fluid. So I knew about that. I knew that new mammalian moms groomed their offspring and would eat the afterbirth, as it's sometimes called. But I didn't realize how ubiquitous it was. There's well over 4,000 land mammal species, and essentially all of them have been known to engage in placentophagy. Placentophagy isn't it's universal in its ubiquity across species, across taxa, but not all mothers. This has been shown in the wild as well as in captive settings. Eat the placenta every single time. So when I say it's ubiquitous, it's been observed in essentially just about every species. There's a couple of exceptions where there hasn't been observations of placentophagy in camelids, interestingly enough,
Hmm.
which include alpaca and llama. But that may just be because there haven't been and there can be differences in the wild and captivity too, so it could be just an observational thing.
Yeah. And so one of the things that I want to point out is that you said it's common across most mammals. So that includes herbivores.
Yeah, which is one of the fascinating. It's one of the riddles about placentophagy. So suffice it to say, it is this. It's across thousands of species of mammalian species. Essentially, let's just call it a universal or all but universal. This certainly applies to now humans. It applies to all of our closest primate ancestors. All the great apes consume placenta. Gorillas, orangs, bonobos, chimps. So we know that what's in our primate evolutionary past. And maybe it's reemerged now among humans, or maybe we did consume the placenta much more commonly in eras past, but we certainly do now. And placentophagy it's a health practice that we now see all over the world. It's not just limited to the U.S., where it presumably either started or was reboosted back in the late 60s, 1960s, 1970s.
Before we get into human placentophagy, can we actually talk a little bit about the placenta as an organ? Because I think that we need that background to understand kind of some of the motivations that are happening today. What
Sure.
what does the placenta do? How does it come to be?
Yeah. And it's interesting, in my research, I talk to a lot of placentophagic individuals, and I even end up talking about a mother, a postpartum individual eating her placenta. And I often hear placentophagic moms talking about eating my placenta, which is true. It is her placenta, it grew in her body, but it's actually derived from fetal tissue. So the placenta is actually derived from the same tissues that ultimately end up developing into the embryo. The embryo is part of the is the descendant of part of those cells, and then the placenta is the descendant of another cluster of those cells. And it's absolutely essential for growth and development. I mean, this is what keeps the fetus alive, the embryo and then fetus alive, supplies the nutrients. There's an exchange of blood gases, removal of waste. It is the lifeline for the developing offspring. And again, this is something that we see, and this is a trait across taxa for across species for mammals.
One of the other really interesting things about placentas is that they're also endocrine organs. So they
Right?
also do quite a bit with hormones.
That's right. And in fact, they are biochemical factories. There are hundreds of products, including hormones and peptides, that the placenta produces. And this not only regulates the growth of the placenta and the growth of the embryo and fetus, but also regulates mom's metabolism and changing physiology as well through pregnancy. So yeah, it's, to be honest, Gabby, there's much about that part of the function of placenta that's still unknown. But we certainly do know, and we can talk about one of those in a little bit, which is a very particular molecule that a group of researchers have been looking to positively identify for decades. But yeah, it's a remarkable organ. And the one thing that I failed to it's a temporary organ, and the one thing that I failed to mention is another thing that makes it unique. Failed to mention earlier is that after the birth of the offspring, the placenta is delivered as well. So that's the sort of the end of the line for the placenta. Is the beginning of the life for the offspring.
Which is how we go about eating it. It's that's
Yeah.
actually like a very fair thing. I was watching a video the other day where it was one of those TikTok videos where a woman asked a man like, how many tampons do you think a woman uses in a day on her period? And like the answers ranged from like 1 to like 25. And I was like, you know what? Maybe it is good that we just say
Yeah, we talk
everything,
about this stuff.
the
Yeah,
whole
yeah,
thing.
yeah, yeah. No kidding.
um, okay, so placentophagy. This is something that has become increasingly popular. As you mentioned, like since the 1960s. I live in California, so there's like a lot of like woo woo, like
Oh, yeah,
natural that, and I don't mean that in like a denigrating way, but it's like people are a lot more interested in alternative medicine here, I think.
yeah.
And I was actually recently at a baby shower, and the mother was asked like, oh, are you going to do placenta pills?
Mhm.
So it's like a very common part of the conversation here in a way that it wasn't really in Virginia where I grew up. So
Yeah,
I think that there's definitely like that's how I first learned about it, is a friend of mine got pregnant.
yeah,
Um, so I guess, where do we start? My first question is, when we talk about eating the placenta, are we talking about like cooking it like a steak, eating it raw? I
yeah,
mentioned the placenta pills. Like what does it mean when we say eat the placenta
yeah. Um, well, it can be all those things.
for humans?
So maybe just to round out our conversation about, in general, what the placenta is and how it's then eaten. One thing that I'll mention real quickly is when we think about eating the human placenta, it is it's an organ that when it's delivered, it looks like a dinner plate. Placentas tend to be around a pound or so for full term babies, and they're discoid. For humans, they're a discoid shape. What's really interesting about placentas among mammals is that there are a variety of placental shapes and forms, which is really interesting because if you're an anatomist, and many of your listeners, I'm sure, as serious biological anthropologists, know their anatomy, you know that when you're doing dissection on a rat or a dog or a primate or a human, a lung is a lung, a heart is a heart, a liver is a liver. They pretty much look the same, and the anatomy looks very similar, and of course, the function of the organ is very similar. Not so with placentas, which is very fascinating. They come in a variety of shapes and sizes, three primary different types, and depending on the species, you have that different shaped placenta. Now, the function is always the same, but they certainly do look different. So, but for humans, it's this discoid shape, and it's a particular type of placenta that is very invasive. So the penetration of the organs into the maternal blood supply is super invasive. Of course, this is one of the things that allows human fetuses to grow and develop, and our brains to develop as much as they do during gestation. But this is also, of course, one of the things that makes pregnancy and delivery so dangerous for humans, right? Because that blood supply is, the penetration into that maternal blood supply is so extensive. And so you can have, a lot of hemorrhage. So, sorry, that's a bit of a roundabout way to getting back to what does it mean to eat it. So it's delivered. It's this roughly 1 pound, half a kilo, 10-inch disc. And of course, the umbilicus is attached to that. And how do people eat it? Well, you name it. You can go online, you can find lots of placenta recipes. There are people that prefer to eat it cooked into meals. So, and in fact, some of the very first popular writings about placentophagy back in the 60s, so the very earliest one we can find is in a 1968, I believe, Rolling Stone article about a woman who delivered a placenta, and then they cooked it up into a meal, a stir fry, she says, as I recall, and she and her husband and midwife all ate it together. So there are still recipes for that. Some women also choose to eat it raw, and raw means, quote unquote here, raw means different things to different people and practitioners. So for some, that means literally cutting off pieces of placenta shortly after delivery and swallowing them. Probably not chewing them much because it's a pretty tough organ, but just cutting off small bite-sized pieces and just swallowing it. Other people choose not to process it in any way other than to freeze it. So rather than trying to eat a significant portion of it right after delivery, they'll typically strip the placenta of its membranes, wash it, maybe cut it up into pieces, and then freeze it. And then they'll eat several small bite-sized pieces a day. Others will process it in some way. And this is the most common way. So for the vast majority of people who are consuming their placenta, they'll consume it in one of two ways in terms of more significant processing. One would be to dry the placenta just in relatively low temperature dehydration, and those temperatures range, but not really cook it, but dehydrate it so it's like jerky and it passes the snap test where you can take a piece of it and break it between your fingers. And then once you get it to that level of dehydration, then you grind it up like in a coffee grinder, and you put it into little gelatin capsules, and then it's just like taking a vitamin or something several times a day for a couple of weeks. And then the last group, and it's probably split about 50-50, about half of the people that consume their placenta in capsule form, again, which is the majority of people who consume their placenta today, will do it that way. And the other half will cook it first. Usually this is for safety reasons. They're concerned about any potential contaminants or pathogens in the placenta. And so they cook it, you typically steam it, and then dehydrate it, and then grind it up, and then put it into a capsule. So those are the most common ways. I forgot one other common way for people that freeze it or consume it relatively quickly after delivery, and that is take pieces of it and put it into a blender with like a smoothie.
Huh.
So that's a very, very common way, particularly if they freeze the placenta and just take out, and they're consuming, several bite-sized pieces a day. They'll just drop that into a smoothie when they're making their fruit smoothie and consume it that way.
Yeah. One of the really interesting things that I have found through my friend's pregnancy is that there is like a huge business around placentas. There is placenta art.
Yeah, oh yeah.
That people they'll make art using your placenta. There is a bunch of people that will help you encapsulate your placenta to eat it. There's a whole industry around this, which when I first heard about this, assumed it was like people who were really committed who were doing this themselves, and but no, there's a bunch of professionals who are committed to this. I guess the next logical question would be, why would women want to do this?
I do want to mention real quickly, Gabby, I thought of one other person. I don't want to, for your listeners who say, yes, but you forgot an important way that you can consume the placenta. Tinctures is one other way where this is sort of along the sort of homeopathic line, They'll take portions of the placenta, little sections of placenta, and put this in some sort of solution, and alcohol-based or otherwise, and then they'll sort of reduce a tincture they take with droppers
Uh-huh.
as well. So that's just want to make sure I talk about that. That's something that's relatively rare, but it still is yet one more creative way to consume placenta. And I think that my this is sort of anecdotal, but my sense is that the tinctures are particularly popular in parts of Europe and Germany and elsewhere where homeopathy is really, really strong. So your question was, why would women do this? So the answer is very clear, at least for where we have good data, and the best data we have on this, on attitudes and beliefs and motivations for consuming placenta, is US postpartum individuals, and in Canada and the UK. Those are the areas where we have the best surveys, we have the best qualitative data. And we've done a couple of really large studies. Most of those tend to be, number in the dozens or hundreds of participants that are usually surveyed. We've done a couple of medical records-based studies, my colleagues and I, from Oregon State University, Melissa Cheney, who's a medical anthropologist there, and Mark Boberg there in public health. And we've done two studies where we've looked at ends of thousands, 8,000 in one study, 6,000 in another, and we've asked the question of what motivates you to consume. What's your primary motivation? And you couple that with the other surveys that have been done, and there's one clear winner with respect to a primary motivating factor, and that is preventing postpartum depression, improving mood. It isn't always preventing postpartum depression. We've found this with some of the more in-depth qualitative work. When people are checking boxes, that's the one they're likely to check. But if you talk with them at more length about that, they'll say, well, it's not necessarily to prevent postpartum depression, but I know that many new moms are exhausted and don't sleep well and are quick to negative emotions and anger and also depression. And so placenta is seen as a mood enhancer across a range of things. But depression, but baby blues and postpartum depression is certainly a huge part of that. Concern about it, maybe fear about it based on a previous pregnancy, or just conversations with friends and family who have gone through baby blues or full postpartum depression. Baby blues is this sort of period of emotional lability in the first couple of weeks after pregnancy that almost all women, maybe 85-90% of women, experience. It's not depression, but it's just very sort of drastic mood swings and a lot of sort of emotion just simmering under the surface that some women find a little uncomfortable and are concerned that it's going to
Continue.
prevent them from yeah.
Yeah.
So that's the number one reason. Now there's many others. We've certainly documented in a 2013 survey that we published. There was a whole range of things: increased energy, better sleep. There is some survey reports that suggest pain relief.
What about lactation?
Lactation, absolutely. In fact, that's one of the more common ones, along with energy. Energy and lactation are probably the second and third ranked benefits, perceived benefits. But there's the others that I mentioned and more. It's seen as a real kind of cure-all, or just general beneficial supplement.
So, okay, I'm going to ask you a question, and I'm trying to elevate the subtlety of this question, which is, what is the thinking behind why they think that this would work? And then I will follow this up later with, does it actually work? But what is the thinking that goes into the placenta will help me with these things?
Yeah, I wish I had a really clear and good answer to that. I mean, I think that this really started as kind of a grassroots movement, placentophagy in general. Again, in the late 60s and 70s, that's when we see the first sort of popular media mentions of it. Very briefly, I mentioned the Rolling Stone article. It was also in some other popular media, sort of quick, brief mentions to it. And then it also starts to show up in some of the medical literature. And at first, it was really and it still primarily is associated with the home birth, midwife assisted childbirth scenario. So people who are interested in natural home births, natural births at home, assisted by a midwife, these are the folks to this day that are most likely to be interested in placentophagy, which makes sense. These are typically people who don't want to medicalize their pregnancy or their childbirth, right? They don't want it to be part of a medical condition that they have to manage or treat. This is for I think the vast majority of these folks, this is a very natural and beautiful time, and they don't want to medicalize it. And so a lot of the early descriptions about the process was, hey, this is a natural part of the human experience, and we are part of the natural world. And mammals do this. We're a mammal. We should extend that natural process to include things like eating the placenta. It must be good for you. Nature has prescribed it. Mammals do this thing. We should probably also do it. It's likely to help us. And you couple that with some early advocates who spread the word that women reported, and the women themselves reporting really positive experiences. And I think it starts to grow very, very slowly. Again, this is all the way back in the 70s, this is 50 years ago. And I think it slowly sort of builds some momentum, and particularly for people who were absolutely committed to natural childbirth and staying out of the hospital. And these were also people who probably are much more likely to lean on what are considered natural remedies, natural medicine. It slowly builds somewhat of a following, again, at this grassroots level. Then something happens around 2000 that sort of changes the ballgame. And that's two things. One, the internet, and two, encapsulation. So there's this growing movement, particularly in the home birth and midwife circles, that people are aware of placentophagy. And then once you get to this innovation of, and people attribute this to a couple of things: traditional Chinese medicine in general, because this is the way it is prepared as a remedy in traditional Chinese medicine, dried human placenta, and also Raven Lang, who was an early proponent of this. But whatever was responsible for this, around the time that the internet was taking over the world, people are like, oh, you can eat your placenta, and you can do it in a way that is not cutting off a piece of placenta and trying to swallow it raw or cooking it into a pasta dish. You can take it in a pill every day for a couple of weeks. And those two things together, I think, really led to its popular appeal and its sort of explosion and its real emergence as a complementary and alternative medicine. And I think that's also the moment that it became more of a complementary component. Before that, it was strictly, I think, kind of an alternative health practice. It becomes a complementary practice when you get encapsulation. And in fact, we see that by 2010 or so, a lot of women who were giving birth in the hospital rather than at home, right, and even getting C-sections, are requesting their placentas.
So, can I ask you something? I
Sure.
hear you saying the word complementary. Like, do you mean like? I feel like that means something in particular.
Yeah. Well, for people that are interested in integrative and complementary and alternative medicine, I mean, they all mean something a little bit different. I suppose there's different definitions, but I think the complementary alternative medicine distinction is a good one. Alternative medicine typically means to most practitioners and also people who are advocates of alternative medicine, these are alternative to biomedical remedies. So medicines themselves, they tend to be much more They're going to be quote unquote natural, right? They're going to come directly from plant substances. They're going to be taken as supplements, or in the case of homeopathy, right? But that's just a tincture dilution process. That isn't a big pharma, right? A synthetic medicinal process. This is taking natural remedies. And of course, there's long-standing, ethnobotanical traditions and so forth. And naturopathy is a part of that tradition, particularly in the West. Again, focusing on natural remedies, and also the sort of holistic approach, right, of treating the whole person. And you need the right diet in general, and an exercise routine, and probably other spiritual elements as well. So that's alternative. Complementary medicine are practices that are considered non-orthodox from a biomedical perspective, but are seen as positive. I mean, they're complementary, they're additional, right? So you still go to your OBGYN, you're still giving birth in a hospital, you're maybe even having a C-section in the case of placentophagy, but you're interested in some complementary sort of health practices as well. And one of those might be, and I'm going to eat my placenta. Or I'm going to wear a particular type, or I'm going to use an amber amulet, or when I'm nursing, or something like that. So they're less exclusionary, and they're seen as a complement to biomedical practices rather than a true alternative to them.
That's really interesting. I had always kind of thought about it as one or the other, but that makes a lot more sense. That people can kind of live in the middle. I think probably most people live in the middle somewhere.
Yeah, no, and I think increasingly that is the case. And in fact, you now have, this would have been unthinkable 30 years ago, you now have, as part of the NIH, essentially a division dedicated in the National Institutes of Health to integrative, complementary, and alternative medicine, with a huge budget and millions of dollars spent on research and so forth. That would have been laughable 30 or 40 years ago. No one would have ever believed that was possible. But that reflects sort of the changing attitudes, not only, I think, of the average American, but it also, I think, reflects the increasing realization by biomedical scientists and practitioners that there is something to some of this stuff. Not all of it, right? But some of these practices are beneficial and are helpful. And I mean, you just look at all of the research now that's going into psychotropic drugs, psychedelic drugs, and their effectiveness with respect to treating depression and anxiety and other mental health disorders. And I mean, that is a really, medical anthropologists have been talking about the healing effects of psychedelic medicines or drugs for many, many decades.
Yeah, it's definitely really interesting. I feel like some of the most fun people in any anthropology department are the ethnobotanists.
That's true.
Those guys have done, I don't know how to say it other than they've done a lot of drugs.
Right. They're people you definitely want to invite to make sure at the departmental party. Yes.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yes. Lots of great stories at the very least.
Okay, so wait, back to the placentophagy. So we know why women would want to do this. I'm not 100% clear on what mechanism they think is actually at work here, but whatever the mechanism is, I don't know if they know either.
There's ideas.
Okay.
I mean, I think in general, it's always very relatively vague, right? But it's things like, well, first of all, they would cite the fact that this is a ubiquitous mammalian behavior, and they would say, look, nature isn't going to build this into our behavioral repertoire unless it was beneficial. Mm-hmm. And they've kind of got a good point there. It's difficult to imagine how this could be such a highly conserved behavior if there wasn't some benefit to it. But they say it's natural, and therefore, nature's proving right. They also say, well, postpartum, in terms of hormonal dysregulation, this is also known from a scientific perspective. We know that the placenta is a factory for hormones, and particularly the ones that become so highly dysregulated after pregnancy, with the estrogens, progesterone, and so forth. And so this is a way of restoring the balance in the body, right? If you expel this temporary endocrine organ, essentially, and your hormones then go crazy, and then by reincorporating that tissue into your body, you're going to rebalance your hormonal profile sooner. It's also, they say, this must be a wonderful source of other nutrients and other essential compounds that would help with health. So those are the
Mechanisms.
sorts of explanations that are given.
The hormone one is interesting to me. And this goes right into my next question, which is like, is it actually effective? The hormone one is interesting to me in particular. I was really interested in endocrinology in grad school, which is if you process the placenta,
Yeah,
you can end up basically breaking down a lot of those hormones that you're actually interested in ingesting.
it's true. And I think this is one of the reasons, 10 years ago, Gabby, almost everybody that consumed their placentas, almost all of the placenta encapsulators, the placenta remedy specialists who prepare your placenta for you so you don't have to deal with that right after you've given birth. And they charge a fee, typically. And many midwives do this too. Steamed it. They cooked it first, right? And then they dehydrated it at a relatively high temperature. Right? And then they ground it into a powder and put it into capsules. Maybe 80-90% of all encapsulated placenta was done that way. Now it's probably closer, as I mentioned earlier, to 50-50. As there's been some research done and from some colleagues and friends in Jena, Germany, have done some really interesting tissue studies where they've looked at the effect of high temperature dehydration and cooking and the effect on the hormones that are present in the tissue, and it reduces it in some cases 95 to 99% of the hormones compared to the raw tissue are depleted. So there is a growing awareness that any sort of heat processing really degrades the hormones. Now they're still there, and in a study that we did, back published in 2018, where we did a small randomized controlled trial, we showed that there was a dose response relationship between, and we had to steam it for safety reasons. So the placenta capsules that women were taking in our trial, they were consuming placenta that was steamed, high temperature dehydrated, and then encapsulated. But still, there were detectable hormones in those capsules, and we found a dose response relationship between that and how much of those hormones got into women's circulation. So it was greatly reduced, but it's there. So in answer to your question, hormones are in there. And even if you steam it and high temperature dehydrate it, it does get into circulation. Now the question is, once it gets into circulation, is it meeting certain physiological thresholds that might be beneficial? And that's sort of the question. That's still the open question. I think it makes it much less likely that you're going to reach those thresholds with high temperature cooking and dehydration. And that again is why I think you're getting a lot more women who don't cook it first or eat it raw. And typically they freeze it first and then eat pieces without cooking it at all. So yeah.
Yeah. So another question I have is like, I saw that you recently had a study that came out about whether or not it was having the desired effect amongst people who were taking it. Like, was it improving postpartum, like the
big one?
Yeah. Was it reducing the number of cases of postpartum depression? Was it reducing the intensity or of the baby blues? Like, does it actually help in that way?
So, as I said, there's been very precious few studies that have really looked at this carefully and rigorously. We had our phase 1 trial. Those results were published in 2018. Reviewers can look those up. We looked at effects. So we not only looked at whether or not there were these hormones and other biomarkers in the placenta, but if they got into women's circulation, and then we tried to assess outcomes, right? This was a randomized trial, right? This was a double-blind, placebo-controlled trial. So in the placebo group and in the experimental group, there's only about 30 women, 27 women total. So this is a very small phase 1 trial, right? It's mostly a safety trial. And then you also, if you can glean some other information on outcomes, great, but it's really a safety trial. And what we found is, and we looked at a large number of outcomes, everything from effects on lactation. And the way we measured that was we looked at neonatal growth, right? We also looked at the amount of prolactin boost that women got by eating the placenta capsules. We looked at sleep quality. We looked at mood. And there was various instruments we used to measure that. We looked at energy levels, fatigue, in other words. And we didn't find any clear signal that there were significant differences between the placebo and the experimental group with this. We actually saw some improvement in mood during the first week in the placenta group, statistically significant. But when you look at the overall period of time for the study, those kind of washed out. But again, really, really small study. And so take that with a grain of salt. There's been one other observational study, again, still a small n though. I think the number of women that consumed the placenta was around 30, and then they compared them to around 100 folks who didn't consume the placenta, and then looked at things like EPDS scores. We just published, in fact, it just came out last week, an article in Biomed Central Pregnancy and Childbirth. So this is hot off the presses. And we had this is another medical records-based study. We had over 6,000 medical records of women who participated in this study. And we did a propensity score analysis, which is essentially just a way of trying to control for as many variables as we can, right? Because this isn't a randomized placebo-controlled trial, right? We're looking at basically comparing women that consumed their placenta versus those that didn't. And we try to match these two groups as well as possible. And we matched them over 90 variables. And this included things like a history of depression and so forth, because that's always been the primary concern, that you have a self-selecting group of women who are consuming the placenta, and they're just much more likely to maybe have suffered from depression in the past, perhaps. So each one of those groups had almost 2,000 women in them. And again, kind of exquisitely matched to each other as best as we could, 90 variables, as I mentioned. And we essentially we compared whether the group that ate their placenta versus the group that did not eat the placenta. We looked at a screening score for postpartum depression at 6 weeks. That's typically when this postpartum visit took place. And so they were given this instrument called the Edinburgh Postpartum Depression Scale, EPDS, and it's used to sort of flag women who are at risk or who may indeed already be depressed. And so we compared the scores of the consumers versus the non-consumers. And we kind of figured that before we did any sort of adjustment in the analysis that the consumers would probably have higher EPDS score. The higher the score, the more likely you are to be depressed, right? But we thought, well, that's because they're probably the folks that are most concerned about getting postpartum depression because of past history. So after the matching, and that is what we found that the consumers were higher. But we thought, well, once we match them, we're probably going to see no difference, or who knows, maybe even there'll be some improvement for the women who consume the placenta. And much to our surprise, the women who consumed their placentas, even compared to this exquisitely matched control group of women who did not eat their placentas, the women that ate their placentas had higher EPDS scores, significantly higher. And depending on which cutoff you use for the screening tool, we're talking about 5-10% increase, even more. And again, depending on the cutoff, and there's different cutoffs are argued in the literature. So we didn't wade into that debate. We just said we're going to look at all the cutoffs and report all of it. That was really puzzling. It was a surprise. And my thinking about this is so how to explain that? Of course, one cannot rule out the possibility that somehow consuming the placenta leads to a degradation of mood, that it leads to postpartum depression. That seems highly unlikely. It would appear that the much more likely, although we can't eliminate that possibility, I want to reiterate that. It would seem that the much more likely explanation is that there were some factors that we didn't control for. We had 90 variables that we controlled for, but there was a suite of factors that in this data set, this medical data records data set that we collected, didn't have this information. And that would be information like quality of spousal support and extent of it, social support, difficulties with initiating and maintaining breastfeeding, sleep quality. These are all factors that we know are very much related to a woman's predisposition to becoming depressed postpartum. And we didn't have those data. And it's our interpretation that the most likely explanation for our results is that this is a self selection process. The women that are consuming their placenta are the women that are the most at risk for developing postpartum depression. And they know it. And they not only know that they are experiencing more anxiety, they're more socially isolated, they maybe have a poor relationship with their partner, they're sleeping poorly, they're having a difficult time initiating breastfeeding. One or all of those things are happening to them. They have also a history of depression. And so they're really, really concerned about postpartum depression. And more so than the average, let's say, quote unquote, pregnant women. And so they're the ones that are consuming it. And of course, because they're at higher risk, that means the prevalence is likely to be higher too, because indeed they are at higher risk. That's what that means. So what this does suggest is that they're probably not, placentophagy doesn't appear to be effective at preventing postpartum depression. I think our data do support that, at least at this point, and based on the way women were consuming the placenta, and we weren't able to control how they processed it, or how much they took or when. So there may be. It's possible it still, under some conditions, might be beneficial, but I would say for the average woman, our study suggests that it's probably not effective at preventing postpartum depression. But I think it does point to this real lack of options and a sense of desperation for many women who are so concerned about postpartum depression and want to do something actively to try to prevent it or diminish its impact. And there really just aren't many options out there. If you're not willing to take psychotropic drugs, antidepressants, which many women aren't, particularly if they're breastfeeding, and there's really only one FDA approved medication for postpartum depression, and it's a hospital stay, and it's an infusion, 60-hour infusion, and you're separated from your infant. And I mean, it's highly effective, but it's incredibly expensive and it's really invasive. And for the vast majority of women, they are not willing to or don't want to go through that. So what are the options? Placentophagy is one of the only options out there, and to try something that is likely safe and every indication is that it is safe. And if you follow sort of standard practices in terms of preparation. And, you couple that with the fact that in survey after survey, and certainly in our work too, you ask women about their experiences of placentophagy, overwhelmingly positive. In fact, in a 2013 article that we did, where we looked at about 150 women who'd consumed their placentas, and one of the questions we asked is, based on your experience, if you were to get pregnant again, would you consume the placenta again? 98% of the women said yes. So clearly they feel something positive is happening. Whether or not the scores are lower on average for people who consume placenta versus not for postpartum depression is another issue. But I think this idea of hope and this idea that something can be done to help prevent postpartum depression is a really powerful medicine in and of itself. And I think that helps explain why placentophagy continues to be a real option for many women. And in spite of the fact that we don't have any really good evidence at all yet from a objective health outcomes perspective – that it is effective.
Yes, pregnancy and childbirth are very scary things, like objectively to happen. Like they're a super dangerous time in women's lives. Unfortunately, especially in the United States, and especially in certain communities.
Yeah.
Do you anticipate being able to do a phase 2 trial, the experiment?
I would love for that to happen. It's an enormous undertaking, and it's an expensive undertaking, and I'm not sure that that'll come out of my lab, but I would love to see that done. I'd love to see others pick up on this research. I think there's still maybe some other questions we need to answer first before we're actually ready, honestly, for a phase 2 trial. I think we need to better hone in on dose and preparation. I think all the indications are that one wants to eat the placenta without heat processing it at all. If that means frozen or that means without even chilling the placenta, just consuming it either, swallowing pieces of the placenta or blending a frozen piece into a smoothie or something. I think that's important in getting a better idea about dosage. I think we also maybe have some new questions about other potential mechanisms of action, like pain relief, which we didn't get a chance to talk about today, but that's something that's out there in the literature, in experimental animal literature, and that placentophagy, if there's one thing that we do know that it does, it enhances pain relief. And most of that work has been done with rodents, but there's really, really good experimental research to show that there is something in placenta, so a molecule called POEF, placental opioid enhancing factor, that really enhances or increases the effectiveness of endogenous opioids that the mom's likely to produce during pregnancy. And that's exciting. And undoubtedly, that hasn't been shown yet in humans, but the POEF molecule is in human placenta. And as I mentioned really much earlier in the podcast, in some surveys, pain relief is reported as one of the benefits. So I think we need to, sort of fine tune some of our variables here and some of the things, some of our questions that we might be asking. We didn't ask about pain relief, for example, in our earlier phase 1 trial. But eventually, I really hope that happens, Gabby. And I think that there is the potential under probably pretty tight circumstances. I mean, I think the dose and the preparation method are going to be critical to see objective improved outcomes.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and one of the things that we talked about the first time we talked, so not on this show, is like some of the like potential reasons that animals do it that people like put forward, like it's to prevent predators from
Right.
scenting and like all of this stuff.
Yes.
So if you want to hear that, you have to listen to the podcast that's coming out. I have 4 questions for you. One, I know you have children. Have you tried placenta?
I have not. That's always a shock to people. I've got one child, a 10-year-old girl, and no, I did not consume it. Sometimes my wife chose not to at the time. This was, this was at a time where there wasn't as much good data about safety, and I think we're at a point now where we can say that placentophagy is safe. It might not be as effective as some would argue from these physiological objective outcome measures, but it's safe.
Yeah, it's so that's the other thing that's interesting about placentophagy is like one of the things that you have to overcome is like how do you prepare it in such a way that someone will consume it who is
That's
not
right.
just like,
Yes.
because like some people will consume it no matter what. And this is part of why I did the cannibalism podcast is like some people are like,
Yeah.
yeah, no problem. It's
Right.
fine. And then most people are like, absolutely not.
Absolutely not. Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
So that's also an interesting thing that I'm going to be thinking about for a while. Okay, so the final 3 questions on the show are the same for everyone.
Okay.
The first question is if someone wants to learn more about the work you do and like placentophagy and like maternal health outcomes, medical anthropology, where's a good place for them to start?
Yeah. So you're talking about my work in particular?
Yeah, your work or medical anthropology or like kind of like whatever, both if you want.
Sure. Well, certainly for my work, I would encourage you to go to my bio page at the University of Nevada,
Which
Las
I will
Vegas,
link in the show notes.
Department of Anthropology. Thank you for that. And I have some links in there to talk about our lab group and our research, and some links to some of our recent publications. This most recent one isn't up right now. Maybe by the time the show comes out, it will be. I'll make sure that that one's up. For medical anthropology, of course, there's a lot of great courses and texts on medical anthropology. And there's such a variety out there. A lot of people, and perhaps more folks of your listeners, actually, Gabby, would be interested in evolutionary medicine, sort of that perspective in medical anthropology. And there's some outstanding books there. Gluckman and Hansen's book. Michael Winkelmann's got some great stuff on medical anthropology that has a strong sort of evolutionary medicine component. I think that you could probably go to Amazon Books and type in medical anthropology, and you'd be overwhelmed with the number of resources that are out there. So, of course, always consider that upper division course at your local university or college too.
Okay. What are you reading for work right now?
What I'm reading for work is mostly stuff on POEF. So really, I've got a student that is just finishing up his doctoral dissertation research, and he's been working with Mark Crystal and his team in Buffalo State, and so I'm really interested on the latest POEF research, because again, I think that that's a really important part of the puzzle that we really haven't looked at carefully yet with respect to human placentophagy.
And then final question is, what are you consuming for fun right now? So this could be like a book or a podcast or a TV series, or someone said hiking, all sorts of different things.
I
Probably
am.
not hiking
I'm
right
trying
now.
to enjoy the outside. I'm trying to enjoy the outdoors right now. I know that sounds crazy because I'm in Las Vegas and we're in the middle of a heat wave right now. We're recording this in late July.
Yeah.
But I just got back from Glacier National Park, and I'm getting ready to go to Mount Shasta. And I love to fly fish. I love to mountain bike, and I'm doing as much of that as I possibly can this summer before we start the year again.
I agree that does sound crazy in the middle of a heat wave, but
But
more
it makes it
power to you.
all the more desirable for me right now. It makes the Mount Shasta calling that much louder.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of questions on this show.
I love it. I always enjoy talking to you anytime.
Well, I will hopefully see you soon and have so much fun in California.
Thanks a lot, Gabby.
Hey there. That was the end of the original episode, but there's more. And that is because Dr. Benyshek got in touch with me after we recorded and said that he wanted to change his answers to the "What are you reading right now" segment. And I was totally happy to do it, but I was about to leave for the Galapagos. And so I set up a time for a few weeks out. While I was gone, Dr. Benyshek got bad news about his health, and that was followed shortly by the shooting at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. But Dr. Benyshek still wanted to re-record, so that's what we did. I left in his original answers because I actually think he did a really great job of answering the questions, especially if you want to know more about his research. This upcoming segment isn't so much about that. So yeah, thanks for sticking around to listen to the new segment. Here it is.
Well,
Yeah.
pretty good. I mean, all things considered, Gabby.
Yeah, this shit sucks, dude.
It's been quite a couple of weeks. I had no idea what was coming. Long and the short of it is that I started getting these auras. I didn't know what they were about a month ago, and eventually, my wife, we knew something was terribly wrong. We were on our way to the hospital to find out what was happening. And one of these auras turned into an actual seizure where I lost consciousness for several hours. And by the time I got there a few minutes later, of course, they got me in immediately and started doing tests, and very quickly found out that I that I had brain cancer. I have primary brain cancer, glioblastoma, stage 4, and probably got between 6 and 12 months to live. There'll be some efforts to slow things down and try to give me a little bit longer, but and apologies ahead of time, Gabby. My memory isn't all that great. I'm on a lot of I'm on a lot of meds right now, including anti-seizure medications, so my recall and so forth aren't great. But in any case, I'm going to be on a therapy that's radiation therapy and then also some chemo, and that's just to slow things down, try to give me a little bit extra time. But anyway, it's been quite a shock and a tough thing to get my mind around. But on the other hand, Gabby, I'm 60. I've had an amazing life, and I feel so fortunate to have lived the life that I have, to have had the career, to have had the home life. I'm married to the love of my life. I've got a 10-year-old daughter who's amazing. I've got incredible friends and family. I've done everything that I want to do, from travel to I'm a skier and a climber and a cyclist, and I've done all those things to a great extent, pretty much as much as I've ever wanted to do, and I feel so fortunate to have done that. So the big thing for me, I'll tell you, Gabby, is one of the reasons I wanted to come back on is, to tell you about my latest diagnosis, and to say that I really appreciate, particularly because I'm sure you've heard about the terrible news here at UNLV.
Yeah.
The tragic situation that happened last week. This happened right after I was diagnosed with primary stage 4 brain cancer, and so it was literally on the cusp of it a couple of days later. So it was just terrible. We lost 3 colleagues in that mass shooting, and of course, I'd like to live longer than 6 months or a year, but on the other hand, I'm going to have 6 months or a year to say goodbye, to have a nice, long, beautiful goodbye to this sweet consciousness, and to tell the people that I love so much in this world how much they mean to me, and what a wonderful life I've had, and what a wonderful thing to be able to do that. My colleagues weren't able to. They were their lives were ripped away from them in a moment, and they didn't even get a chance to say goodbye to their loved ones. So that's not lost on me. It's important to me. So there's that.
Yeah, certainly.
But listen, I don't have my stamina is poor. I sleep mostly these days, but I do have the 2 things that I wanted to share with you about, that you always ask about, what folks are reading and what folks are listening to.
Yes.
And if I may,
yes, please.
in the podcasts, this is not a surprise given my recent news about my stage 4 brain cancer. I don't know if you know of Roland Griffiths. He's a cross-cultural psychologist, Johns Hopkins. He died back in October. He died ultimately of complications of colon cancer. And he was a person very much interested in psychedelics and psychedelic medicine, and really sort of brought psychedelic medicine to the fore in the contemporary era, and brought it back as a very, very serious object of study. Of course, we know now today that there's all kinds of new therapies associated with ayahuasca and psilocybin and so forth, related to not only mental illness, but also using these things in terms of end-of-life processes, and finding meaning and finding the significance of those experiences with the use of those psychedelics. So he was an incredible researcher And he did several podcasts, Gabby, but one of the ones that was terrific was Sam Harris's. This is about a year ago. He was already diagnosed with terminal cancer, and he did some subsequent to that too. There's several that are excellent, but Sam Harris's podcast with him was outstanding, and it covered his work, his remarkable work at Johns Hopkins, and his pioneering work, and how it made a difference in his life, his ability again to say goodbye and to have those moments of meaning making with his loved ones. So that's been incredibly powerful. I'd like to think that I was already heading down that path anyway, but to listen to his perspective on these things has been a real gift. So I highly recommend any of Roland Griffith's any of his podcasts, but especially the ones since he was diagnosed with terminal cancer and then, as I said, passed away in October. And then for reading, I've got to be able to toss out one more book too.
Of course.
David Sampson, who I happen to know pretty well. He's at the University of Toronto, terrific biological anthropologist, a sleep specialist, but he's got wide-ranging interests. But he wrote a book called Our Tribal Future with Macmillan Publishing, Our Tribal Future. And I greatly appreciate what David's book's about. I think that the title might scare some folks initially, talking about tribalism. It doesn't need to. I understand why some people might say, "Oh, well, are we? We're going to talk about tribalism in a way that is prejudicial and is negative." And David talks about tribalism as part of one of the things that makes us human beings. And he talks about how tribalism is something that can definitely lead to some terrible impulses and some terrible things that have happened, particularly in the contemporary world. But he also talks about how it is an essential part of who and what we are as human beings, and that we can harness those same. We can harness what tribalism is. This sense of community and of help and compassion for those that we identify as us, right? However we want to define that, if we want to just define it as our species, right? It doesn't have to be sectarian in terms of small scale in versus out groups, but instead this idea of finding that interconnection with others and then harnessing that for good things rather than genocide and other bad things that we oftentimes associate with that kind of in versus out group. So I thought it was a really terrific take. I was a little skeptical when I first heard about the book, and I'm happy to say that I went in with open eyes and learned something. And I like his approach about what we can learn from our tribal foundations and what we can do with it.
Yeah, I mean, that's the heart of what we do, going in with open eyes and learning something new.
For sure.
All right, so that's the end for real. I want to take a minute to share my gratitude with you the way that Dr. Benyshek shared his with me. Thank you for coming along with me on this whole podcasting journey. I wouldn't have guessed that so many people would agree to come on the show or that so many people would want to listen to it. I'm honestly blown away by all the emails that I get, even when I've been missing in action for months at a time. Thank you. I really, really appreciate you all. And I'll see you soon on another episode. Thanks for joining me for this episode of the Anthrobiology Podcast. If you have questions or comments, you can reach me at gabby.lapera@anthrobiology.com. That's spelled GABY.LAPERA@anthrobiology.com. This show is produced by me. Music courtesy of Chad Crouch, aka Poddington Bear at Sound of Picture.